Welcome back. This is week 10, lecture 1, the truce and the precipice of war. Now, an alternative title to this lecture would be Between the Two Wars, namely between World War I and World War II. But World War I at the time was known as the Great War, and there was no concept of World War II until the outbreak of war in 1939 to 1940, where once again the Western world, and in some ways the entire world, found itself at war. There's a big difference in terms of historical interpretation and understanding between looking back, as we do. I mean, historians, we look back, um, and the phrase or the saying that hindsight is 2020 may or may not be true, but at least if we're looking back, it gives us a very different perspective than trying to look forward, so to speak, and place ourselves in the time as it's developing. And that's what I hope to achieve, at least some insight into what the tenor was, what were the feelings and the fears and the worries and the concerns after the Great War, which was a shock to the consciousness of the world in some ways, as I'll be talking more about and already have in terms of World War One. At the time, how was it developing at the time? Which is again is very different perspective from looking back on it to see like, oh, if only this had been done, if only we had done this, if we hadn't done this, things could have been avoided, things could have been much better. That's maybe true or maybe not. That's the other problem with history is we can say, oh, if only that had happened, everything would have been fine. But we can't go back and really see if that were the case because we don't know that that would have been the case. Because as things are developing going forward, it's all indeterminate. Whereas in hindsight, we say, oh, that was the problem. But was it? Because we don't really know because we don't have an alternative to compare it with. We can't go back and rerun history, so to speak. And that is the danger of this hindsight looking back, even though that's an important perspective to take, of course. But what I hope to achieve is to see somewhat of how it was all developing. Now, last week, the two lectures on the Russian Revolution and then the problem of the Middle East points to some of the problems with the immediate aftermath of World War One, or what we now call the World War One, or the Great War, the war to end all wars. That's how it was perceived. The Great War as the war to end all wars, but did it? And if it didn't, why not? What was going on at the time? And this sense of the truce and the peace, that's why I say truce in quotation marks, because it was like, is this really going to work? There's still problems that are out there. And again, last week's two lectures pointed to some of those, namely the Russian Revolution and the emergence of the USSR, and then the problems, ongoing problems in the Middle East that were still very prevalent, um, even as the Treaty of Versailles was being signed in Paris, or just outside of Paris. So that's what this is kind of looking at. So it's kind of going back to some of the same issues that we've been dealing with in terms of 2 weeks ago in World War One, and then the aftermath of the Russian Revolution in the Middle East. Here we're going back and looking at the kind of the development. And to do so, this is really quite a complex period. This period in the aftermath of World War II. The readings for this week, chapters 27 and 28, I believe it is. Or is it 26, 27? Forget exactly, but there's no other readings. There's no document reading for this week because I want you to focus on some of the details. And again, it's very complex and there's a lot of details in the textbook. So again, the lecture here is designed to help you through it in terms of following a single line, so to speak, even though we have to add in the Russian Revolution, the Middle East, on top of some of the things I've been saying here. Now, so that's kind of the context. So let's go back and look at then what happened after the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations, and to begin to realize that the Treaty of Versailles didn't really solve things. It may have ended things. That's why, again, I say truce. There was still a great deal of political instability, as I said, with the Russian Revolution and and the problems in the Middle East, and even just with the aftermath of how the treaty was put together and didn't really solve anything. I think I already mentioned that the famous statement that, this is not a peace, this is a 20-year truce. That was the concept. There was worries and concerns. And so what were some of the issues there? Now, in terms of the ending of the Great War, we have the armistice, the ending of conflict, the agreement to stop fighting, which was agreed upon on November 11th, 1918, which still used to be called Armistice Day. And then it was another, 7 months or so before the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And there were other treaties too, but the Treaty of Versailles is the main one. But in terms of the complexities of the conflict, the world conflict, this was not simply a war between two parties, but the entire world basically was at war. And so peace treaties had to be established between Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, France, Britain, the U.S., between all the different factions that were at war in the Great War. The Treaty of Versailles was a major one, and it was formulated by Britain and the United States and France, and it was, again, signed on June 28th, 1919, and it assigned responsibility for the war and the guilt for the war on Germany. Their German guilt. It almost was trying to force Germany to say, yes, we were at fault. This was our fault. And then it also imposed reparations to say, because it was all your fault, you're going to have to pay for it, to help cover the costs and also the penalties of having done so, especially to France, to Britain, not so much to the U.S., but it was a major um, economic penalty that was imposed. And there I have there the reparations. Germany was to pay 132 billion gold marks, which at the time was approximately equal to 12.5 billion US dollars in 1919, 1920, which was equivalent of approximately $225.6 billion today, with inflation and the whole bit. Now, in the workings out of the treaty, they were only required to come up with 50 billion gold marks, 4.74 billion in 1919, or 22.56 billion today. Now you say, okay, well, why? Well, that makes sense. It's an arrangement. It's like, okay, here's the penalty. I mean, in legal terms, we do that today. Here's your penalty, your sentence, but then we'll commute some of that sentence, and this is what you actually have to do. So if you have a 20-year prison sentence, we're going to commute that to say, okay, you have to actually serve in prison 5 or 10 years, and then you'll be on probation or whatever. In some ways, that was the approach in the Treaty of Versailles. But still, that is a lot of money. $22.56 billion today. Our national budget has gone through the roof in terms of it being several $1 trillion a year, which we can't even conceive of $1 trillion. And yet, still, if the United States government, or if England or France or Germany or any of the major governments, even Russia, had to come up with $22.5 billion today, that would be a major expense and a major drain on the economy. Now, it also required Germany to demilitarize. So they had to get rid of their army, their navy, their armed forces. Because it was like Germany was the aggressor. So we're going to take away the means for them to actually wage war. And we're going to have this being overseen by the League of Nations, which is one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to establish a League of Nations, which by design was to be an international organization that would prevent another war, since the Great War was supposedly to be the war to end all wars. We have to have a mechanism to ensure that, and the League of Nations was established. And the League of Nations was a pretty loose and weak organization. We'll see later in later lectures in the aftermath of what became World War II. It was the establishment of the United Nations, the UN. And regardless of what you might think about the UN today in terms of its power, and strength, and authority, and there's all kinds of problems there, which we'll be talking about later. The UN was much more functional and had much more teeth, let's say, in terms of its authority to impose sanctions and things, than did the League of Nations. The League of Nations was really a weak, ineffectual organization. It wasn't designed that way. It wasn't intended to be that way. Just the way it was set up, it didn't really have the means to be able to actually prevent war, especially to deal with the problems of the new Germany, which was the end of the Second Reich that had begun with German unification and Bismarck's establishment of the Second German Reich. That came falling apart within 40 years, from 1870 to 1920, 40, 50 years. And what was imposed upon Germany was a republican form of government. It became known as the Weimar Republic. And that the Weimar Republic, the new government of Germany, had to accept the humiliation of Germany by all of a sudden now not having a military of its own, having to pay these reparations, and having the entire world say you were the cause of the Great War, which was, by all considerations, a shock to the consciousness of everyone in the world, the horrors and depth of the war. Now, in terms of the political instability within this context, as we're trying to deal with, or as people at the time were trying to deal with the aftermath of the Great War and what to do about it and how to prevent any future wars, there's still an instability within world politics. And here, as I said to begin, I've already pointed to the Russian Revolution and the problem of the Middle East, which were undermining stability. And with Lenin coming to power and then establishing the USSR, there is increasing fear of the USSR, the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, the USSR. There's fear of communism, or what became known as communism, which really was not Marx's understanding of communism, as I've said before, but it was really Leninism and then Stalinism, because Lenin had proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat. I talked about this when talking about the Russian Revolution. Rather than waiting for, calling for, trying to bring about that class consciousness of the proletariat, to bring about a revolution, as Marx called for, as Marx saw as a natural progression of history, Lenin says, no, we are going to impose a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, obviously, the government is in charge as the dictatorship for the people, the common people, the proletariat. That's a very different approach than Marx's theory about historical development and world economy. Lenin, in 1922, just as the Soviet Union is established, basically has a stroke, and he dies 2 years later in 1924. But already after his stroke, it was severe enough that he could no longer lead the USSR, and so Joseph Stalin comes into power in the Soviet Union. And Stalin just continued and furthered Lenin's basic foundation of the USSR in establishing and creating the USSR to say, here is what we're going to do. We have a 5-year plan in terms of economic development, in terms of industrial production. And Stalin's point was we were really going to try to ramp up Soviet industrial production. And this is going to continue in terms of how we are going to manage this dictatorship of the proletariat. And really what we have brought about is a revolution from above. Now that phrase that was Stalin's, revolution from above, as well as the dictatorship of the proletariat, is a completely different approach than anything ever before. Revolution, almost by definition, was always, with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, the common people, those not in power, revolting against those in power. And what this was we are in power and we are going to effect a revolution of society from above in a dictatorial manner. So the whole problem here is this approach was very much not Marx, even if it was based on some of Marx's ideas, but has become associated with that. So in the more popular minds still today, Marxism, communism, and the Soviet understanding of it, as we'll see later, China as well, and as the Soviet influence spread, has all been equated as one thing, and especially since socialist is in the very title of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Socialism and communism becomes identified. That becomes identified with Marxism, and it's seen as all as one thing as communism, even though it was not the communism. It was communism for Lenin and Stalin. They would refer to it as communism, but it's a very different communism than the communism that Marx appealed to and applied to and saw that was necessary, because for Marx, as I said already earlier on in the lecture on Marx, he opposed communism to socialism at the time in terms of the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. But now they're all seem to be associated. And we're going to come up see that term socialist again shortly in this lecture in a very different context. So when you hear the term socialist or socialism, you need to always ask yourself, what is it really referring to? What does it really mean? How is it being used in this context? Okay, that was the instability after the Treaty of Versailles, and it was not a positive. It was undermining what had always been seen, the modern paradigm. I've talked about modernity and early modernity, and we see the switch from early modernity to modernity in the period of the Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, really. And this idea coming from the Enlightenment of the nation state, which predates the Enlightenment, of course, as I talked about, comes out of the Reformation in the 16th century, this emergence of the nation state, replacing the myth of the nation state, as I referred to it, replacing the myth of Christendom, was seen as independent entities. And the wars that had been going on in the course of the 19th century were usually nation state against nation state. The Great War was the war of the world. All of a sudden, this is not supposed to happen. And individuals were seen, coming out of the Enlightenment, as autonomous, independent, rational people. And we could rationally work things out. And that was being undermined. But that idea of rational individual people was undermined by then a number of intellectual developments that really I'll be talking a lot more about in the lecture in a few weeks on postmodernism, because we really see the beginnings of postmodernism in this period of, let's say, 1900 and 1920. I'm not going to be talking much about it here. I'll talk about it more later in terms of postmodernism. But Freud is working at this time and all of a sudden starts talking about, the unconscious, the subconscious, the archaeology of the psyche with the superego, ego, and the libido that undermine this concept of we are independent, rational thinkers that are completely in control, can all be rational. Now, the modern paradigm was also based upon Newtonian physics, where everything worked according to laws of nature that we can understand, very mechanical in that sense. Force, cause, impact, and effect, and all those different aspects that Newton had brought forward into one overarching understanding of the physical universe. That began to be undermined too with the new physics. And the only reason I'm kind of bringing in the new physics here, rather than waiting for the lecture on postmodernism, the postmodernity, which I'll talk about it too in a little bit more depth, is because some of the developments in the new physics were directly played into what was going to be happening after the Great War and as conflict broke out again. So just kind of very briefly going through this, we have the new physics, and let's say that starts with Albert Einstein. They're the dates of Einstein, 1879 to 1955. And in 1895, Einstein moves to Switzerland, becomes a Swiss citizen in 1901. He's working at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. And in 1905, he receives his PhD from the University of Zurich. Also in 1905, he publishes 4 groundbreaking papers that had major impact, whereby 1905 for Einstein has been referred to as his annus mirabilis, or his miracle year, because how could someone publish four major papers that were revolutionizing all of our understanding of the natural world. And one of those papers was his theory of special relativity, that time and place is not a constant, but our understanding is based on our point of observation. And time is different depending on where we are and how we're measured, also based on motion. This is, the issue of a train going by and your clock and where you see. And I'm not going to go into the theory of special relativity either philosophically or certainly not mathematically. And this is not his M equals mc or E equals mc squared formula. That was coming a bit later. But the special theory of special relativity was pointing to a fact that not everything is Newtonian. Relativity didn't really fit with Newton's understanding of the universe. That begins to undermine our sense of security in what it is that we see when we're looking out there in the world. Now, in 1914, he moves from Zurich to Berlin and works for the Prussian Academy of Sciences at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And in 1915, he publishes his theory of general relativity, whereby it's not simply based on one point of observation, but there is a general relativity in the universe. And this is the E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times a constant squared, which is a nice, simple little formula. Mathematically, I can't even begin to explain it. But what it means is in all of the universe, everything is relative. And there's a continuum of time and space, whereby time and space are basically the same thing. That gets into issues of curved space, which just try to wrap your mind around curved space out there in the universe. So all of these things are all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, the universe is not what we thought. Things don't work that well. And in 1917, after his general theory of relativity, he becomes director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, becomes a German citizen once again. In 1921, receives a Nobel Prize in Physics. And yet he begins to see problems developing in Germany and political turmoil and what's going on in 1933 as he's visiting the United States. He already had been there at Caltech on a visiting appointment for a while. He's visiting the U.S., and because of the political situation in Germany, he feels he wants to get out, and so he applies for asylum to be able to stay in the U.S. And he's granted that. And this is there with the rise of Hitler and also the increasing anti-Semitism. Albert Einstein, he's Jewish. There were a number of eminent German scientists, scholars who left Germany, got out in time, let's say, and came to the United States. A whole slew of them, so to speak. And Einstein then had a position at the Advanced Institute of Princeton until his death in 1955. But here I have about, in terms of his work challenging the Newtonian universe in the modern paradigm, he really did. And what was even then a furthering of that was the splitting of the atom in 1932. Now, Einstein had developed his theories of relativity based still on the Newtonian concept that the atom was the smallest building block of matter. In 1932, an experiment, not by Einstein, by two others whose names I forget, with an atomic accelerator, basically shooting two atoms at each other, all of a sudden they broke apart. And for the first time, it was seen that an atom is not the smallest. There's a nucleus, and then there's electrons, and within the nucleus, when we split that nucleus of the atom, we have protons and neutrons. And so there's smaller subatomic particles that become together to form the atom. So the atom is not the smallest building block of matter. There are subatomic particles that are. And in some ways, from 1932, with the splitting of the atom up until still today, we've just seen more and more and more and more subatomic particles. We talk about more about that in the development of what's called quantum mechanics. We get to more postmodernism. The whole theory of quantum mechanics was like the mechanics of subatomic particles Einstein was wary of. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, when it was seen that the atom could be split apart and the nucleus could be split apart in 1932, what does the government do? In some ways, scientific and technological innovations have always been fueled by, I'm not going to say completely directed by, but co-opted into the development of the government and particularly of the military and weapons. I go back in medieval times in terms of the development of the longbow physically, which was like a better bow and arrow, development of guns and gunpowders and cannons, the development of the rifle, and on we go. It's like we can weaponize this new scientific discovery. And in 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt um, began the Manhattan Project. Now, in 1942, as we'll see, this is in the midst after new conflict had already broken out, which made this weaponization of this new scientific discovery even more perhaps important, because the idea was if we can harness the energy of the atom and the nucleus of the atom to make a weapon, an atomic bomb, that will be a bigger weapon than has ever been conceived of. And they knew that Germans were working on it. And fortunately, a lot of the top German physicists had left, including Einstein. So if we can somehow organize this into a project, there's Manhattan Project because it started in Manhattan, but really the laboratory was in Los Alamitos in New Mexico. That was what was going on there. So that is why I talk about the new physics, because as we'll see, the atomic bomb was what, let's say, ended the war in the Pacific of what became known as World War II. But we'll get there, right, actually, with World War II next lecture. Now, so that's going on too at this period between the wars. Obviously, before that too, this whole period, 1900 to 1920 or so, and this period too became known as the Lost Generation. Now, I do not know when the first time was that a name or a title or a label became attributed to a generation. I think it's probably with the Lost Generation. It's the first time. And the term itself comes from American expatriates, authors living in Paris. First of all, Gertrude Stein and then Ernest Hemingway coined the phrase the Lost Generation and referred to people who had come into their majority, their adulthood during World War I. So it's basically people who had been born between like 1880 and 1900. But the term in a more broad sense can be referred to as the entire generation that went through World War I, or what the Great War, and then suffered to its aftermath. Because this period was really a lost period based on the destruction that had gone on, the carnage of the Great War that was a shock to the consciousness and understanding of people worldwide. So when I use the term the lost generation here, I'm not specifically talking about the actual lost generation. I'm talking about it more chronologically. This period, let's say from 1900 to 1940, was a lost generation as such. And on one very real level, it can be seen as a lost generation because of all the deaths resulting from the Great War. And up there in the slide, the Lost Generation, I have death and horror, because never before had there been such carnage. There had been, war was never nice, never easy, it was always horrific. But this brought it to a whole new level. Casualties of the Great War, World War I up there on the slide, is estimated to be approximately 40 million, with 15 to 23 million deaths and approximately 23 million wounded. And of those deaths, 15 to 23 million, 9 to 11 million were part of the military. Just think about that for a minute. Between 9 and 11 million people died fighting in the war. That's huge. But in addition, equally huge, 16 to 13 million civilian deaths as a result of the war. Now, civilians always get caught up in war, but the idea was that nation states had their armies and they would fight against other nation states, whereby the army would go up against the army. Yes, there's collateral damage, which was not the term used at the time in terms of civilians, but basically war was between armies. World War I was a war against peoples. Maybe not by conceptualization, but in practice, in effect, that's what happened. So we have almost an equal number of civilian deaths as military deaths. There's a mobilization of the homeland and everything else that was involved. And that was a shock. And the number of men, because again, in the military at this time is all men. If we have, 15 to 23 million men are lost. And as a consequence, we have a whole generation of what do we do? Number one. Number two, and this was a phenomenon of the Great War, it would become even a more significant phenomenon after what became known as World War II, which we'll talk about when we get there. Women had to step up to take the place of men, both on the home front, predominantly because it was the mobilization of society. And so who's going to do the work that men had always done when they're off in the war fighting and when they die? And women became an increasing important part of the labor force. And part of that, too, comes about what's called the new woman, which is this idea of a woman who is independent, who is capable of being an independent woman, and functioning in a society without a man. Always before, women were seen as property, essentially. They were either daughters, subjected to their fathers, or they were wives, subjected to their husbands, or they were women of ill repute, or they were widows. So those were kind of the options: daughters, wives, or widows. Now, there have been movements for women's rights. We already saw that with Olympe de Gouges, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and a Citizen, and we know what happened to her. The later 19th century was called the Victorian period. In the Victorian period, we have, women, yeah, but Queen Victoria was female. She was very strong and independent. Yes, she was. But this concept, this idea, whether or not it worked out in reality, of the Victorian woman as the idea of the feminine, the wife, the daughter, that became replaced by the new woman, which was independent of male domination. And we can see this in dress and style. Some women started, of course, if you have to go to work, you can't wear your niceties and your big hoop skirts and things and your corsets and everything else, as the Victorian image was. You had to more dress like a man. So women started dressing more like a man, became known in the 1920s as the flappers. Sleek, form-fitting dresses, shorter hair. Women were started to smoke and to drink. And that was a shock to male society, because all of a sudden it's like, women are not supposed to act this way. Because I'm being sexist. No, I'm not. I'm just looking back at the development. Because again, we have to understand the society at the time. The idea that women could, what? Women are working? Women are smoking? This public morality. Now, private morality is a different thing, but public morality of what a woman was supposed to be in public was changing, and it was a threat. With that, with the new independence of women, of working and everything else, became a new push for women's suffrage. Women to have the right to vote, because women did not previously. And have their women's suffrage, and suffrage just means the right to vote. There were certainly suffrage movements in the later 19th century too, but they never really took off. But we'll see they began to. with New Zealand being the first country to on the national level to grant women the vote nationally in 1893, followed by Australia in 1902, Finland in 1906, Canada in 1917, United Kingdom and Germany in 1918, Austria and the Netherlands in 1919, and finally the US in 1920. France not until 1944, Greece not until 1952, and Switzerland not until 1971 in terms of the national level, even though women could vote in cantonal, local more elections before that. But when we look at this, we see the real move and increase in terms of women's suffrage 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, in the context of the aftermath of the First World War, or the Great War. Now, things are changing. Society is changing. Views of what is proper are changing. And in the aftermath of the Great War, with all the political instability and worries and everything else, we still have this sense in some aspects of we were successful, especially in the West. We won. We were managed to defeat the aggressor that was trying to subjugate the world to dictatorship, the German Reich. And part of that became this sense almost of euphoria, because also with the financing of the Great War, that led to an economic boom. So we have this period of prosperity, of victory, of hope, going along with insecurity and worries, which makes in some ways a lot of sense. We don't want to think about all the worries and the problems, so let's just party and have a good time. And the 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties, and the 1920s and 30s became known as the Jazz Age. Jazz developing out of reggae, and ragtime, not reggae, sorry, ragtime and the blues, which were 19th century developments. Scott Joplin was in terms of ragtime. Jazz develops in New Orleans and Louisiana and quickly spreads throughout the world. It is this free style of music that was changing perspectives. So we have this a major cultural change going on, but also worries in terms of the propriety, in terms of women all of a sudden being seemingly out in the public like men, and they are smoking cigarettes, but one of the things they're not going to do is be drinking. So this Jazz Age of the Roaring Twenties kind of was kicked off with Prohibition and the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1919, that became effective in 1920, of the illegality of alcohol. We have the Women's Temperance Union, the teetotalers, as they were called, who were like, alcohol is bad and evil. It leads to all kinds of problems and immorality, so we are going to legislate to have it banned. And that faction, especially in the context of the fear of the new woman, the fear of the new cultural wars, let's say. I mean, we're talking about cultural wars today. We didn't, they weren't talking about the cultural wars at the time, but in fact, that's what was going on, culture war. Prohibition was passed. Now, what happens when you ban something in general? Well, in general, it just makes it more popular. So we have the rise then of clubs and that would have alcohol, so it was known where you could go to get alcohol. We have bootlegging, which is illegal alcohol. So there's this sense of we are doing this independently of what the government is saying, and we're going to have a great time going to our jazz clubs and getting alcohol and drinking and partying and having a good time, even though that was not supposed to happen, because still there's this aspect of optimism and prosperity. That is all great and was going on, even if in tension between change and no, we need to keep things the way they were. That's kind of what's going on. The war happened, yes, but we need to basically go back the way things were beforehand. The status quo ante, as it was called, and is called, the state of things before. Can't happen. So we have this conservative movement of trying to get back to the way things were, as things are slipping away and culture is changing and getting out of hand. That was where prohibition was coming from. We have to clamp down on some of these things. And yet that just spawns new development and new change. It all came crashing down in 1929 with the stock market crash and the beginnings of the Great Depression. The Great Depression. Um, the Great Depression, uh, my parents were children of the Great Depression. My father was born in 1926. My mother was born in 1929, that fateful year. Technically, they were part of what would become known as the greatest generation, those people who came of age during what became known as World War II. But again, not looking back, but looking at the time, they certainly didn't say, "Oh, now I'm part of the greatest generation." I mean, again, these labels are later applied to these people. And it's not like today where I'm Gen Z, I'm Gen Y, I'm a millennial, or whatever. That consciousness wasn't really there at the time, and the people who were born during this time that became part of the greatest generation certainly were born in the depth of the Depression. 1926 it wasn't, but 1929 all kind of starts. And I have stories from my mom and my dad about the Depression, what it was like growing up in the Depression. My mom grew up in a small little Central California coastal town. She had, in her view, an idyllic childhood. But just as an example, we'd go over to visit my grandma and grandpa in Morro Bay, California, frequently. I won't go into my whole family history. And one of the things I started doing over there, because we were right on the coast, was fishing. And their house, which my grandpa had built, was on Main Street, but right across from actually the oyster plant. And so they had their own dock. I would just go across the street and fish. My grandpa taught me how to fish, but he rarely ever came fishing with me. He did it, of course, a few times at first. Um, and he did not say I shouldn't do it. But my mom later told me that he hated fishing. Why? Because during the Depression, he fished and he knew that if he didn't catch something, they would not eat. My mom would go out with him. So my mom thought, this is great. Out in the bay, in a boat with her dad, having a great time. But for my grandpa, he was tense and worried. Now, my father grew up on a Central California farm. Um, I remember him talking about how they ate a lot of rice and beans. But so they had a farm. So they had some means of survival if they could keep the farm, which they were able to, and they did. They could grow their own food. They would have gardens and grow things. So it was, but a very different perspective on wealth and what was available. And we have all kinds of stories also because the Depression was not just the U.S., it was European wide, if not worldwide, of sparsity, of poverty, of, you would hold things and use it to the beginning. I mean, I grew up, just in terms of food, and this is a holdover from my parents who grew up in the Great Depression. They would serve me my plate of food, and I had to eat all of it. We can't waste it. Now I could come back and get seconds if I wanted, but if I got seconds, I also had to eat all that I gave myself. Think, oh my God, what was that all about? But that's how they grew up because it's like food was not something that you wasted because there was not very much of it, and we should be grateful for what we have. That has a very different mentality of, my kids grow up. I don't like that. Okay, well, what do you like? Well, no, I'll have some of this. No, I don't want to finish. Okay, well, a very different perspective. That's all coming out of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, as I said, it hit after 1929. But in Germany, for example, when the Depression hit, Germany was already in severe financial problems resulting from the reparations. They had a lot of money to pay back. They are being humiliated. What do we do? And one of the things they did to try, as a means of trying to meet their financial obligations to pay the reparations, they went off the gold standard. The gold standard from the later 19th century until, actually in some ways, about the 1960s or even 70s, was a way of saying that every dollar, using the U.S. as an example, every dollar was based on a specific quantity of gold. The gold coin. We used to have gold coins, dollar coin with the gold. And even when paper money came about, we called gold backs. You could take it to the bank and say, "I want some gold for your paper dollar," and you would get gold. We still have gold reserves, but the whole economic basis of the gold standard, or then later the silver standard, which was the same thing, having silver as the basis of the money. I'm not going to go into the whole monetary issues of the development of monetary policy and prophecy when it goes back to the Roman times and the debasing of the currency. So if you have a silver coin, it's like so much silver. But what they started doing already in Roman times was, okay, we're going to make a coin that looks like silver all over, but we're going to use, tin instead, or we're going to use copper inside and just cover it with silver. That way we, are not paying as much. So there's a devaluation with of the currency when it's being debased. But still, there's that standard. So Germany said, we can't have the reserves. We don't have the gold to back the payments. They said gold marks. That was what they were supposed to be paying in gold marks. Gold standard. So we're going to go off of that, just pay with marks. This led to what's called hyperinflation. We have issues with inflation today, but just look at some of these issues in terms of what was going on in Germany between 1921 and 1923 with the impact of the reparations and going off the gold standard. In 1914, before the end of the Great War, before the reparations, with exchange rates, there were about 4.2 German marks to the US dollar. In early 1921, so the first few months of 1921, that rose, which is after the Paris Peace Treaty and so, or the Treaty of Versailles, that rose to 64 marks to the dollar. So the exchange rate is going, the dollar is staying relatively stable. The marks are, is inflation are going way, way up. By the later 1921, by the end of the year, there are 330 marks to the dollar. A year later, just 1 year later, December of 1922, 7,400 marks to the dollar. And in November of 1923, so even less than a year later, the inflation, this is how bad the inflation was. It's called hyperinflation. 4,210,500,000,000 marks to $1. Now we talk about inflation is not very good. Okay, oh my gosh, inflation is rising 6-7%. That's horrific. Now it's gotten back down to under 4%, which is almost normal, because inflation is a natural thing in terms of the growth of the economy. It comes with growth of prices and inflation. But this hyperinflation was beyond anything that ever had been and anything ever since. Just on a personal level, we have up there the cost of a loaf of bread in 1922 was it cost 116 marks or 160 marks. By the end of 1923, it cost 200 billion marks. That's a problem. That was going on in Germany, causing social disruption, economic horrors. What do we do about all of this? When in 1929, the stock market crashed. Have their Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market overnight fell 11%. It's a huge drop. If we talk today about the stock market dropping 1%, that's pretty big, or 2% is huge. This is 11%, and then the next Monday, it fell another 12%. And then the next day, it fell another 11%. And between April 1930, thereafter, between April 1930 and July 1932, the stock market fell 89%. Now, what does this really mean? It means that the economic basis of society is crumbling. People were jumping out of windows. People lost money right and left. And it just got worse and worse. And what do you do if your investments have disappeared? So, well, at least I'll go get my cash. There were runs on banks. Now, banks were supposed to have, reserves. So if you deposit, $100 in the bank, you go and say, I want my $100. They get $100. But they use your $100, right? You give them $100 deposit in the bank. They'll take maybe, 80 of those dollars and invest it. That's how they make their money. Or loan it out to somebody else who wants a loan, invest it in their different projects. And of course, they have reserves sufficiently that if you come say, I want my $100 back, they say, fine, you don't get the same $100, but you still get $100. That reserve, that cash on hand reserve, there's a policy for how much today they have to have legally. But at this time, there were no policies. So the more they can loan out, the more they can invest, they would. And so all of a sudden, it's like when I go to get my $100 out, it's like, we're not going to give you that because we don't really have it. Now, of course, they would have $100, but when all of a sudden people start rushing to the bank to get their cash, they don't have the cash and they close down. And banks fail because they don't have, they let all the money go. And what happened? You lost it all. If a bank went bankrupt, you lost it all, which led to more problems, which led to then failing of business and unemployment. Now, again, today, what normal unemployment is 4 to 5% usually in terms of a fully employed society. Now we're under 4% here. Our employment rate is one of the best it's been in a very long time, if not ever. So again, percentage-wise, in Australia, 1932, unemployment was at 29%. In Canada, 1933, at 27%. These are the peaks. Now, France remained, pretty stable. Unemployment remained like 5% or less. But Germany, unemployment, again, with the hyperinflation, rose to 30% of the population were unemployed. The USSR, however, was basically unaffected by the Great Depression. I mean, it may be an overstatement, but since they were doing fine, they're more a closed economy, a managed economy. Were taking care of themselves, and they did not suffer the horrors of what was going on in the free market capitalistic system. In the UK, in 1930, unemployment peaked at 20%, but regionally it varied. So, like in the Northwest, where Liverpool is, and so on, I was in Liverpool for a couple of years. Severe unemployment, 70% unemployment in Liverpool. So that causes problems. And the same in the U.S., regional variations, but in aggregate in 1933, unemployment in the U.S. topped out at 25%. Now, that is a problem. It's a problem because of the people who aren't working. What do you do? What do you do with them? And we'll see this shortly. This is before there's any type of social network. You would starve. Charitable organizations would form soup lines and soup kitchens where people could try to go. But the government, what do? There's a huge mess going on in terms of I know this is not a technical term, but it is insecurity. It is worry. It is, feeling that can I survive until tomorrow? Can I get work someplace? What kind of work can I get? How are we going to survive? And isn't the government responsible for helping us? That didn't come about until 1933. Because in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. Herbert Hoover had been president from 1929 to 1933. And before him, it was Calvin Coolidge. And Hoover was president with the Great Crash and the onset of the Great Depression. Now, both Coolidge, before he became president after Woodrow Wilson, is famous for saying the business of America is business. Now, that's not quite the precise quotation, but it still gets at the essence that really we need to focus on business, which is based on this laissez-faire Adam Smith understanding of capitalism. We just let the market take care of itself. No regulation, no banking regulation. And what happened? It led to monopolies, and it led to the prosperity of the roaring 20s. Things were going great. But then the robber barons and everything else associated with that. Andrew Carnegie, one of the robber barons. I live right next to the Carnegie Library in Spades Park. Um, J.D. Rockefeller, the robber barons, Leland Stanford. Um, on we go. Hearst, William Randolph Hearst. It all crashed. It all crashed. And the economies of the Western world were suffering and failing. The Soviet Union was doing fine. France still was suffering with the Great Depression, even though unemployment wasn't that bad. And Roosevelt said that we have to do something. We can't just stand back and let people starve and be out of work and go hungry. And in 1933, gets passed a series of acts. The Emergency Banking Act, which sets up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, meaning to deal with the issue of bank failures, we're going to pass a law that will regulate how much money the banks need to keep on hand if people come to the bank to take care of it. And we're going to do that on a federal basis, even if an individual bank doesn't have the money, they can get it from the federal insurance company. And that there was a requirement that your deposits up to, well, today it's $250,000, are insured. So if you have $300,000 in the bank, and if you want to go and withdraw all of it, you can. It may take them a while to get it up to $250,000. Now, today, if you say I want all 300,000, they'll say okay. But if the bank failed, you could get up to $250,000. Wouldn't get your whole 300,000. That's the insurance that was there, that was established as part of what became known as the New Deal of Roosevelt, FDR. He also then issued the Securities Act, which was a way of regulating the stock market to say, okay, we're not going to allow this kind of a free fall. So when the stock market closes down, if it falls too much, this is a way of safeguarding the catastrophe that was going on in the economy and had hit the economy. And then to help with unemployment, we're going to establish there's three different things: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Projects Progress Administration, and the Civil Works Administration, in order to provide jobs for people based on government money. And they were still technically on the gold standard, but we're still going to just spend government funds. My grandfather, my grandpa, my mom's dad, not only fished, he then got a job with the Public Works Administration, building the state park in Morro Bay. He also built a trail up what's called Morro Rock. So he's working for the government programs that gave them paid workers to work for public works, or for putting people to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps. On we go too. And he also worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps. So that was a way to deal with the unemployment issue, and therefore also the poverty issue. And then we're going to have the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is going to deal with industry and how to help industries continue to function in light of the economic catastrophe. And the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 and 36 to deal with, okay, how do companies have to treat labor to give them a sufficient wage that if there is a downturn, we can somehow deal with it. And then the Social Security Act of 1935. Social Security Act providing Social Security. So you could apply for government funds if you did lose your job or then retired. Because before this, there was no such thing. If you stopped working, if the company wasn't going to give you a pension, the government wasn't paying you anything. How are you going to survive? How are you going to retire? Social Security brought that in. And then the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and others as well. But all of this combined was referred to as FDR's the New Deal. And it was passed by a coalition of Democrats, because FDR was a Democrat, Hoover and Coolidge had been Republicans. But it was passed by a coalition of Democrats and Republicans, even though there was a conservative coalition of Republicans who were against it, saying, no, this is not right. Yeah, okay, there's a problem, but we can solve it without having all this governmental programming. That tension would remain. A faction of the Republicans against the New Deal, some Republicans and the Democrats for the New Deal, and there's conflict and tensions. Just as there was tensions in terms of the cultural wars in the 1920s between, let's say, the progressives, even at the time referred to as progressives, of the people who accepted and went with the new cultural developments of the new woman and the jazz age and everything else, and the conservatives who want to go back to the way it was before the Great War. Things all made sense and were reasonable what they knew. That's the issue. Now, the Great Depression brought about unemployment, poverty, insecurity, with attempts to then address those problems in society with government programs of the New Deal. Now, I'm looking at the time, and this has gone on for longer than I had hoped. I hope we can stick a little bit longer with me. This lecture is going to go far beyond the normal time. I will try to then shorten the next lecture, which I know this is on World War II, but your textbook does cover it, but I'll try to keep that a shorter lecture. So overall, this week's lectures will be about the same, I hope. So if you can just bear with me for a little bit longer, because I want to get this done, so to speak. Because in this context of the lost generation, the Great Depression that was going on, affecting everybody, and the hyperinflation in Germany, that we have the rise of Hitler. And not only the rise of Hitler, but the rise of fascism. Fascism. It's one of those terms that we think of, ooh. We can see it as basically a populist nationalism to counter the threat of communism. That's kind of the tensions. And this populist nationalism is like, okay, in Italy, first with Mussolini, or first concurrently within Germany, Mussolini is like, we are going to put Italians first. It's the little phrase, at least Mussolini made the trains run on time, huh? We are going to make society better by imposing structure for Italians. They never said we're going to be a dictator as such, but basically it's like, we are going to implement this. Now, the problem is we have Stalin in dictatorship from above, and the revolution from above, and the 5-year plan, and Soviet Union, in light of the Depression, was doing just fine. So the idea almost was, we have to somehow, we don't want to go the socialist, communist, Soviet way, but we need to have directive authority to make things right. And to do so for our people, we're going to kind of mobilize our people, the Italians, and put Italians first. And Mussolini comes to power as the leader of that position. And in Germany, there's this sense of, we are going to put Germans first. And what was Germany? What were Germans? That gets to be an issue, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in this lecture, in this part of the slide. It's based on race, Aryanism. The Germanic Aryans are what the Germans define the Germans, and those people who are living in Germany who aren't of the Aryan Germanic race are not really Germans. And in 1920 was formed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which became known as the Nazis. And here I referenced before the issue of the term socialist. Here, the term socialist should actually be seen as populist. It's not saying socialist as in Marx or Lenin or Stalin socialism or socialist governments. It is saying this is a social movement of workers in Germany, of the true Germans. That's why I say it's popularism of the true Germans. That's what we're focusing on. So it's the national, let's say, populist German Workers' Party. We're going to put people back to work. We're going to get the country on track, because it is a problem, especially after the Treaty of Versailles. And the whole point of the party was to, in some ways, counter the reparations and counter what had happened after the Treaty of Versailles to Germany and what was happening to real ethnic blood Germans. And they adopted as their flag the swastika as the symbol of the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They had 25 points, of which here I just have a few. Repudiate the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles, we're not going to recognize it. We're not going to follow it. We're going to then unify Germany in what had become Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the borders in Austria, because Austria is comprised of Germans too. We're going to get rid of the undesirables, the Jews. The Jews are not really German. They've always been a foreign entity here within Christendom. We have Christians, and then the Jews are not Christians, so they're not really part of it. Now, the whole history of anti-Semitism, as I said, is a long one. I talked about the Dreyfus Affair and the increasing pogroms and the whole issue in the Middle East and the problem with what we do with the Jews. But this became part of the Nazi program, and explicitly we're putting this all forward as an opposition to communism, to the Soviet Union, and the spread of communist ideas. And Hitler even says later, the world will thank me eventually because I will have saved it from communism. And we're going to focus on German workers and German business, the common German business and the common German workers. And that is what we're all about. To Germany first. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Germany, Germany above all. That was the idea and the motivation of the platform. And that is the party that Hitler became a part of. And as a young man, he joined the Nazi Party in Vienna in 1923. He and a colleague, was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, take over kind of leadership of the party to an extent in terms of making his voice very prevalent within the party. He also writes Mein Kampf in 1923, which kind of is the personal position of Hitler adopting the Nazi 25 points in some ways. We need to take every advantage we have. And what was going on within this context of the hyperinflation is Germany was struggling and couldn't really pay its reparations. And so in 1924, France wasn't being paid. And so what do? They go and occupy the Ruhr in kind of central Germany, the Ruhr Valley. And they say, okay, we are going to just take our assets. What do if you don't pay your debts? Your assets get seized. That's what France was trying to do when they went into the Ruhr. And Germany says, wait, this can't be. We need to do this. We need to find some kind of an agreement. And there was a number of agreements called the Locarno agreements that then tried to, Locarno agreements that tried to then settle the problem. Say, okay, how can we help Germany to pay its agreements? We have to loosen up a little bit, and we can have several different agreements coming up here, and that was all put together in 1925 because we can understand the problems that they're under. And then, but yet we have the Kellogg-Briand Act was issued in 1928 to say, but we can't use war, or Germany can't use war in any way, in terms of a means of national policy. So those two things kind of are in place, which doesn't really solve the issue. And the Nazi Party becomes increasingly popular and is winning votes in the Reichstag. And in 1933, Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. Now, in 1932, just the year before, Hitler and the Nazi Party, received 36.8% of the vote in the Reichstag. Now, that's a pretty significant amount because, again, the Reichstag is a coalition of different parties, not just a two-party system. There are several different parties. So to have 36.8%, that's a very large amount. But Hindenburg was the chancellor, and he says, okay, because of that impact of the Nazi parties in the election of 32, we will kind of will work with Hitler as the head of the party to come up with a ruling government. But that really didn't really work out. And then Hindenburg said, okay, I quit. And in 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. January 30th, 1933. In February, then, as Chancellor of Germany, Hitler issues a decree suspending civil liberties of the Germans. Why? To guard against communism. Also, to try to get people back to work, to try to deal with the inflation, with the social problems, the unemployment. He says, okay, in this kind of a situation, we need to restrict civil liberties, so we're going to do that. In order to get people back to work, in order to guard against the threat of communist takeover, because with all the social economic problems, there we have the Soviet Union still seemingly doing just fine, and the danger is that that is going to influence people to come in and turn Germany communist, or turn the West communist, and we're not going to allow that. That's why he says, the future generations will thank me for saving the world from communism. So it's this sense of Nazi Germany with Hitler opposing communism and the threat of communism. And in March of 1933, the Reichstag, the legislature, the German legislature, passes the Enabling Act, saying, okay, Herr Hitler, we enable you to deal with the situation because we can see that it's working. You are solving the problems. We then give you the authority to rule by decree. So what you proclaim to be the case, it will be the Enabling Act, voted on by the Reichstag. This gets to be worrying for France, for Britain, for the United States. Why? Because this is like an authoritative dictatorship now. And yet, Hitler was supported somewhat cautiously. But why? Because we too, Americans, British, French, were against the threat of communism, called appeasement. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, is always thrown at it as the horrible person who had issued the policy of appeasement of Hitler. But Americans supported Hitler too. Not all Americans, not the government, but such, but American businessmen. We'll see in a minute others. So as a way of saying, okay, we're not really sure we like it, but we certainly don't want the alternative to allow Germany to become communist. Now, all of this was supported too in terms of this populist nationalism or socialist, national socialism in the title of the Nazis parties, based on this concept of race and Aryanism, the pure German. And that too was furthered by the US with something called eugenics. And you've probably been studying eugenics already. But eugenics was seen as a science to improve the gene pool of human beings. It was based on the theory of race, and that some races were genetically better than others, superior to others. And it was based on the whole scientific discipline of genetics that was established and based back in the 17th century in terms of breeding and, with both animals and with plants. And we can just apply the same science to human populations. In the later 19th century, it becomes really attempts to apply the theory of genetics and breeding to populations based on race. And Britain and the US actually take the lead in the development of this science, and also within the US in Indiana. Here's a quotation. This is from the IUPUI Project of Center of Bioethics and Medical Humanities. In this is just on their website, telling about it. So that's where this is from. That's where the quotation is from, the website. In 1907, a new law passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor of Indiana provided for the involuntary sterilization of confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. Although it was eventually found to be unconstitutional, this law is widely regarded as the first eugenics sterilization legislation passed in the world. In 1927, a revised law was implemented, and before it was repealed in 1974. Over 2,300 of the state's most vulnerable citizens were involuntarily sterilized. In addition, Indiana established a state-funded committee on mental defectives and that carried out eugenic family studies over the 20 countries and counties, and was home to an active Better Babies movement that encouraged scientific motherhood and infant hygiene as roots to human improvement, end quote. And there were U.S. scientists involved in eugenics that also went to Germany to advise Hitler in terms of let's create a master race. If we want to, help out our society, our population, let's get rid of the undesirables, those who are not contributing. Criminals don't contribute, and criminality is a genetic trait, or so it was seen. Okay, that's what this is. So if we can prevent criminals from reproducing, that will lower overall crime rate. If we can prevent people with developmental handicaps from reproducing, that will improve the population. And let's actively see who is the better race, so that we promote that. We promote the superior races i.e., the Aryan race is referred to, and that just comes from the Caucasus, it is a designation, um, or whites, as opposed to the undesirable lesser races, whether you're brown or black or Asian, because we are the superior race. And so we need to formulate our breeding policies to promote the reproduction of strong, good white people who don't have a criminal background, who aren't or gay, who are not gay, who are not developmentally challenged, who are not weak, have genetic defects, whatever that might be, um, to promote our society as a whole for the good of all. That's kind of, let's say, the theory behind eugenics. As we will forcefully sterilize people to prevent them from breeding. Now, again, over the course of 1907 to 1974, that's a long period of time, and 2,300 people is not that many people, but the whole idea was that was what was going on. And Germany took it and did other things with it. We'll see more about that next lecture. Now, the rise of Hitler. I said the wisdom of hindsight and the blindness of foresight. That's really where I began this lecture. Talking about looking back in hindsight is one thing, but looking at as it's going forward is quite another. And if we look at the rise of Hitler from the point of not knowing what the outcome was going to be, but as it's developing in the context that it was of the lost generation, the Great Depression, the hyperinflation in Germany, and then the huge unemployment and the problems that were going on facing the West as such. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was doing just fine. Thank you very much. And we don't want that. That whole appeasement approach, that whole almost support of Hitler, of what he was doing in Germany. It's like, we need to do this. And then especially those conservative coalition Republicans who opposed the New Deal. Maybe what Hitler was doing was not all that bad. Maybe it was a good way to deal with the situation. Again, not knowing where it was going. That's why I said the blindness of foresight, because no one knew what was going to happen. That's the problem. We can look back and say, oh, what if we had stopped Hitler in 1933 or 34 or 35 or 36 or 37 or 38 or 39? We'll talk more about how what became known as World War II got started next lecture. But here, just keep in mind, we have to understand how it came about. If we're going to understand the problems and the phenomena, we have to look at the science. This populist nationalism, referred to as National Socialism, that led to a fascist government, an authoritarian, the enabling act of Hitler, saying that he can rule by decree. Mussolini in Italy, all opposed to the threat of the Soviet Union and communism, as opposed to the Western mind and our own well-being and prosperity. How do we deal with this? Except for all the powers that be, did they suffer from the Great Depression? Oh yeah, I talked about the people jumping out of windows and things, but the wealthy, the industrialists still were there. They weren't unemployed. Now, so the up to 25% unemployment in the U.S. was that a problem? Oh yes, we have to deal with it somehow, but we are not going to deal with it by going the way of communism. At least I'm not suffering. And Hitler, I can understand very well. Henry Ford, Walt Disney were supporters of Hitler. And maybe we should think about, eugenics. Because maybe if you're unemployed, there's some genetic defect. We can begin to understand it. They had no idea what was coming. But given the time, given the uncertainty, given the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles and the Great War, everything that was designed to prevent another war from ever taking place, so that the Great War would have been truly the war to end all wars, which no one really believed. There were worries and concerns at the time, insecurity, instability, what was going on. But as it was developing, we didn't know what was coming. And it made sense to deal with the problems at hand. We'll see the failure of that approach in the next lecture. Thank you very much. I didn't go that much over time, about 5 minutes or so. But still, I'll try to keep the next lecture as short as possible. Thank you for your patience, and I'll see you again.